German Anabaptists this morning, and we've got a lot to get down about them, so we need to get started. Let me remind you of something we said before, just as a way of background about this. In Germany, the name Anabaptist came to be used with everybody that believed in separation of church and state. That'll get confusing if you read about this. It will get confusing some as we talk about it, because we're going to list people in this study of Anabaptists who did not believe in the Bible as a sole authority, who didn't believe in the Bible as any authority. We're going to list people who did not believe in baptism by immersion of believers only, because in Germany they used that name with anybody that believed in separation of church and state. And so you will sometimes read about the abuses of the Anabaptists in Germany, and you've got to remember who you're talking about. So we're going to be studying real Baptists and people called Baptists. But that shouldn't shock us too much, because if you come to our own day, there are people who are real Baptists, and there are people who are called Baptists. So it's not like we've really gone into any new territory here. Roman numeral 1, we'll take a look at the town of Augsburg, Germany. In 1524, you get 2 people put to death there for teaching Baptist doctrine. And the idea, of course, behind the city putting them to death is they want to stop this stuff before it spreads. But it doesn't work. By 1525, there's a Baptist church started in Augsburg. By 1527, that church has got 1,100 members, which is pretty significant growth for 2 years, especially without bus ministries and radio and all the rest of that. 1,100 by 1527. There are 4 pastors associated with this church at this time. All of them show up someplace else as well in Baptist history, so we're going to go to the trouble of mentioning their names. One of them is Balthasar Hubmaier, who we saw Tuesday. He had fled from Sweden and was here at this church for a while. Hans Deck, German names, folks. Get used to it. Hans Deck. Deck is the senior pastor, the bishop, if you will. That fits the Bible title of bishop. Ludwig Hotzer and Hans Hutt. These 4 preachers are all associated with this church during this 2 years that it has such incredible growth. It was really Hubmaier who'd come and taught these men the Baptist distinctives, and in a sense is responsible for their becoming Baptist. It's Hubmaier who baptized them, but it's Denk himself who is the actual pastor of the church. And this church becomes sort of a center for starting Baptist churches throughout Germany. And it, in that sense, becomes a real historic church. Okay? Roman numeral 2 is Strasbourg. Obviously another German town. The church at Augsburg plants a church in Strasbourg. And Hans Denk moves there and becomes the pastor there. And in 2 years that he's there, this becomes a very large church. Hans Hutt becomes a pastor in Augsburg after Denk leaves. After Denk leaves the church at Augsburg and goes to Strasbourg, Hans Hutt becomes a pastor there. 1527, they call for a meeting of Baptist preachers in Germany, and there's 60 different churches represented. Now, we don't believe that those churches were all started out of Augsburg in that short a period of time. Some of them were. Some of them obviously existed before that. But by then, there are 60 Baptist churches who come to this conference. The church in Strasbourg became so influential that for a considerable period of time, religious liberty is practiced there in Strasbourg. Now that will be important for the reasons that are obvious to us, but I'm going to give another one as well. Yes?
So at this meeting, what was it like?
Yeah, it was just a preacher's meeting where Baptist preachers came together to talk about things. There's no formal structure to it like we would call a convention today, but a preacher's meeting. Among other things that happened during this period of time, a fellow named John Calvin, whose life is in jeopardy in France, moves there. And because of the Baptist influence in Strasbourg, he's safe there, even though he's not a Baptist. And while he's there, he marries the widow of a Baptist preacher. Now that becomes important to us for this reason. John Calvin, will eventually go to Switzerland, become sort of the leading influence in Switzerland after the death of Zwingli. And Calvin himself, besides sponsoring the system of Calvinism that's still influential, Calvin takes a role in persecuting Baptists in Switzerland. And some of his defenders like to say he did not understand what the Baptists really stood for and who they were. Well, he should have. He was protected by them, and he married one of them. So if he didn't understand them, that's a ridiculous argument. Obviously, Calvin understood who the Baptists were. So while he enjoys the blessing of liberty brought by the Baptists, sometime down the road, he certainly doesn't return the favor when he becomes the head in Geneva. Well, Dick dies in 1528. He's been a pastor for 4 years at 2 churches. Dies at age 32. Dies at age 32 in 1528. He'd been a pastor only 4 years. He pastored 2 different churches, but he built 2 churches of over 1,000 in that 4-year pastorate, 4 years pastoring. And remember, he did it without any of the technology that we use today in building churches. Died from a plague. Those are the kind of things that, people start to ask questions. Why would the Lord cut somebody off like this who's having this kind of a ministry and this kind of an impact at age 32? But again, the answer you have to give is he was the Lord's man. That's the Lord's business when he wants to take him. That's not our answer. While we're still under this, let's just put it this way, Roman numeral 3. Other growth and other persecution. Other growth and other persecution. This, of course, begins to disturb a lot of the German authorities. Even in the states that are Lutheran, it disturbs them. And so persecution starts in Augsburg, which for a few years freedom has flourished. By now, the pastor in Augsburg is a fellow named Hans Leupold. And he is arrested at a prayer meeting, and 87 others that were there were arrested with him. That tells you he didn't like most of our fundamental Baptist churches today, because most of them don't have 87 people at prayer meeting. He ends up being beheaded, so are 5 deacons, and all of the rest of them are branded with a hot iron so that they can be identified as a heretic immediately. When that doesn't end the church, they begin to repeatedly come to meetings and arrest everybody that's there. Within 2 years, there's no longer a Baptist church at Augsburg. So many people have been killed, and so many people have been imprisoned, and so many people have fled the town that there's no longer a Baptist church there. In Rottenburg, didn't name it, another German town, but it lives up to it. In Rottenburg, the pastor and all 70 members of the Baptist church were taken, arrested, and beheaded. 70-member church, and they killed every one of them. Similar thing happened in Schwarz, Germany. And interestingly enough, both the pastor in Rottenburg and the pastor in Schwarz had been Roman Catholic priests when they got saved, and they began to preach to their own people, and they studied the Bible and became convinced the Baptist distinctives were right and started a church with many of their former church members from when they had been Roman Catholic priests. But again in Schwarz, they killed the pastor and every church member. At Salzburg, 18 Baptists are burned at the stake. Salzburg. 18 Baptists are burned at the stake. In Linz, 70 are burned at the stake. Just all across Germany, you find Baptist churches popping up, and you find people trying to destroy them by killing the folks. Because of this, as you can guess, the churches quit meeting in the open, and they started calling Baptists the garden brethren, because they would meet out in gardens and forests and farms and so forth. They'd meet out in fields, places where they would not likely be spotted. They quit trying to have buildings. So I'd like you to put that down. You might even be asked about that someday. They began to call them the garden brethren, because they began to meet out in gardens and fields and forests. They began to meet outside of buildings. Roman numeral 4. Favorite German towns. It comes up several times in history. The town of Worms. That's not how it's spelled, though. Town of Worms. In Worms, the Lutheran pastor becomes a Baptist and takes his whole church with him. And one of those little interesting notes that you'd like an explanation on, but I don't think we have one available. When he ends his pastorate, the next guy that takes the pastorate there, the only record we have of him is his nickname. He was called Pastor Hilarious. We do not know why. There's no record of it, but you got to believe there's a story behind that somewhere. But the church there becomes so large that the city council is afraid to deal with it. It becomes so large and so popular. And so for a long time it's able to do that and to be able to function that way. And it sort of takes the place of the church at Augsburg in terms of sending out people to start churches and having that kind of influence. However, while things are going so well there, persecution breaks out in Strasbourg, which had previously been safe. By this time, the pastor there is a fellow named Pilgrim Marbeck, and he writes a book on the separation of church and state. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, he writes this book while he's in prison. But he writes a book on the separation of church and state, and it is a book that is still read and widely quoted from, and it's not unusual at all when you see someone defending the separation of church and state to include a quote from Pilgrim Marbeck. He finally gets released from prison, moves to Augsburg, and dies. And there is a discrepancy in the history books as to his death. I do not know the real answer. Some of the history books say he was put to death by the Lutherans there, and some of them say he died from a disease. So I do not know which is correct. Roman numeral 5. The decree of Emperor Charles V. The decree of Emperor Charles V. This takes place in 1529. He is the Emperor of Germany, and he's very concerned about the spread of the Anabaptists. And so he decreed that any Anabaptist should be put to death. In fact, let me read just a little bit from his decree. Be it clearly ordained that all and every Anabaptist or rebaptized person, whether male or female, being of ripe years and understanding, should be deprived of life, and according to the circumstances of the individual be brought to death by fire, sword, or otherwise, and whenever found should be brought to justice, indicted, and convicted, and be no otherwise judged, tried, or dealt with under pain of heavy and severe punishment. He says you put Anabaptists to death, and if you as local authorities don't put the Anabaptists to death, you face very severe punishment. About the only freedom given to the local rulers is whether they put them to death by fire, sword, or otherwise. So he just instituted capital punishment for being a Baptist. Okay? However, one of the things that is worth noting during this time is that you remember we said that Germany is divided into about 30 states during this period? Some of the rulers of the individual states do defy Charles V and refuse to put Baptists to death. And so they deserve some memory for that. One of them is is the ruler of Hesse, Philip of Hesse. This is the region in Germany the Hessians will come from in the American War for Independence. But at this point they've got a much better ruler than that. He's remembered in history as Philip the Magnanimous because he risks his life to keep from having to carry out the emperor's decree as far as putting Baptists to death. And he's eventually put in prison by Charles V because of it. And then he finally gives in and agrees to do Charles's bidding and is released from prison. He goes back to Hesse and rules. But the truth is he spends an awful lot of time lying to Charles even after that about what he's doing to the Baptists. And so basically through his whole life, even though he publicly gives in, he still ends up being a defender, not just of Baptists, but of other people who were not connected with either the Lutheran or Catholic Church. In the town of Schwarzburg, a Count Gunther does the same thing. He just refuses to obey Charles on this, even to the point that a death sentence gets put on him for doing so. But however the politics of the time work out, the death sentence against him is never carried out. He survives this challenge. but very much at the risk of his own life, he protects the Baptists. Another German town named Wassenberg, with a ruler named Werner von Pallant. There he also protects the Baptists against Charles' decree, and for a long time is successful at it. And again, a large Baptist church develops in this town and is able to send out a number of missionaries to start churches in other German towns as a result. As a matter of fact, this church is having such an influence starting churches. By the way, you realize what it meant when you said you were called to be a missionary or a church planter in that day. We're not just talking about giving up American culture or going through the normal difficulties that we associate today with being a missionary. We're talking about the fact you're probably committing yourself to a lifespan of only a few years, trying to reach as many people as you can before they inevitably get to you and kill you. So we see an awful lot of folks today who commit to missions lightly. You know, they're on the trail to being a missionary until it becomes inconvenient. Let me tell you, these folks had a better understanding of missions than that. Well, this whole success of the church in Wassenberg angers a fellow, you don't need to get the name, Philip Melanchthon. He is Luther's chief assistant, sort of the fellow that focuses on political affairs for Luther, that he presses for persecution of the Baptists and causes other areas to send forces into this region and arrest the pastor of this church. He spends the 20 years left of his life in prison, and they begin to diligently go around Germany looking for the people sent out by this church. And most of the missionaries sent out by this church end up being killed. It's also, actually, we mentioned Balthasar Hubmaier under the Swiss Anabaptists and said a couple of times he recanted but went on preaching. He's actually in this church in Germany, not in Switzerland, when he is taken and refuses to recant and is burned at the stake. What interesting through this period is that you'll see these churches where the pastors get killed, and God will call somebody else to rise up as a pastor, and somebody else will take the position. Okay? We say this, and there's seriousness to it. We say it almost joking, but there are churches today folks refer to as preacher-killing churches. It's just very, very hard to minister in those churches, and people don't stay there very long, and sometimes people leave the ministry after they have stayed there for a while. And I pastored a preacher-killer church, which several of the folks who preceded me left the ministry after trying to pastor there. And they didn't kill me. They wounded me fairly severely, but didn't kill me. But we say that kind of thing almost flippantly. When you talked about preacher-killing churches here, well, it wasn't a church that was killing them, but there were a whole lot of churches that a man was literally putting his life on the line to pastor. But God raised up men that did that. And when you begin to think about that and meditate on that, and we think about some of the difficulties in being in the ministry today and some of the challenges that go with it, they don't seem all that big anymore. Okay? Some of you fellows to think about, what would you do if somebody came to you and said, man, I got an open church here looking for a fellow just like you to pastor it. Of course, the last several pastors have been killed within a couple of years of being there. And would you go there? I'll admit that I'd take a little praying over. But if you thought God called you there, Roman numeral 7. I'm sorry, I meant to list the people like Philip of Hesse that defied the emperor as Roman numeral 6. So if you'll put a Roman numeral 6 by those notes, we'll move on to Roman numeral 7. Roman numeral 7 is the peasants' revolt. Now, we're not going to take a lot of time to look at the whole peasants' revolt or to write things down about it, except as it relates to the Baptists. But let me tell you quickly what happened there. During this period of time when Luther is preaching salvation by faith and preaching leaving the Roman Catholic Church and so forth, there develops in Germany a considerable movement that wants political and economic freedom as well as religious liberty. That's routine, by the way. That is one reason dictators who could care less about anybody's religion persecute churches and withhold religious liberty, because when a person is free to worship the Lord and free to construct their family according to Bible principles, it's only natural to want political freedom and only natural to want economic freedom at the same time. Freedom tends to be a package deal. And so dictators tend to withhold all kinds of freedom. So at the same time that Luther is preaching about spiritual freedom, at least freedom from the bondage of the Catholic Church, there develops a political movement that sort of goes hand in hand with what Luther is doing about overthrowing all of these governments and creating a government under which the people can be free. And it's called the Peasants' Revolt, and it's by and large an attempt to overthrow the nobles and the kings and Emperor Charles and so forth. The head of the Peasants' Revolt, and you ought to put this name down, is a fellow named Thomas Munzer. People call Munzer an Anabaptist because he was attempting to overthrow the state churches in the process of this. However, and I wouldn't mind claiming Munzer as one of us, but the fact is, he was a Lutheran pastor, a Lutheran preacher, as well as being a political leader, and he believed in sprinkling babies. You just can't make him a Baptist, no matter how many history books say he was. He leads this rebellion of the peasants. The peasants form their armies. Their armies go against the armies of the nobles. Anybody want to guess what happens? Armies of the nobles just crush them. And because of that, he's sort of remembered as being an anarchist and a bad guy and all that kind of thing. But the truth is, if you'll recall, there was a fellow named George Washington who formed armies out of farmers and common people and overthrew a noble aristocracy. And we don't remember him the same way. The difference being primarily that he won and Munzer lost. I will tell you, if Munzer had won militarily, he would be remembered as a great hero of freedom today. Now, his timing was obviously bad. He wasn't the military leader that Washington was. But I really believe the Peasants' Revolt was an attempt to fight for freedom that failed, and that doesn't belittle or diminish the motives of the people that fought. You might argue about their timing. Revolutions are a tricky thing, you know. Most of them don't work. I think Munzer was a friend of freedom and ought to be remembered as someone who wanted to do what was right. Most of the Anabaptists supported him in the Peasants' Revolt. Anybody imagine why? They would like to see these governments that were persecuting them overthrown. Many Anabaptists fought in his armies. Sometimes it's called an Anabaptist rebellion, but I think that's a misuse of the word. There were a lot of people in there who had no conception of Baptist distinctives, people in there who had no spiritual interest in this at all. And Munzer himself could not properly be called a Baptist. Okay, but you will read history books that will tell you this was an Anabaptist rebellion, and the Anabaptists were sponsoring anarchy and trying to overthrow the government and so forth. Roman numeral 8. Melchior Hoffman. Melchior Hoffman. He is a former Lutheran preacher who starts preaching separation of church and state and baptism by immersion of believers only. And he attracts a big following. He's a former Lutheran preacher that starts preaching separation of church and state and baptism by immersion of believers only. And he gains a big following. And you can understand the temptation to call him an Anabaptist because of those two truths. But he was not a Baptist. He did not believe in the sole authority of the Scripture. In fact, he thought he was still getting revelation from God today, in his day, and that he was getting prophecies. Yeah, he's very much like Pentecostals today. I would consider him very similar, for example, to an Assembly of God in that sense, who does believe in separation of church and state and does believe in baptism by immersion, but would be insulted if you called him a Baptist. We might be a little insulted too. So he was just convinced he was getting prophecies. And he began to tell people that God had told him the world was going to end in 1533. And he developed a big following of people who were sure the world was going to end in 1533. They thought the Peasants' Revolt, in which so many of them had been killed, was the tribulation. And that the Lord was coming back. However, in 1533, he moved into Strasbourg to wait the coming of the Lord, and the city authorities arrested him. And he spent the next 10 years in prison because the Lord didn't come back. I just have this sneaking suspicion God is not coming back at any time when somebody tells us that he is. I just have that feeling. I was, I don't know, has to be 1987. There was a big book a guy put out, The Lord's Come Back, 1988. And I was pastoring at the time, and we had our church had a youth activity with 2 other churches at one of the church's gymnasium. And I noticed they had youth activity went real well. We talked about doing it again, and we began to kick around some dates. Maybe we'd even do this every 3 months or so. I got to looking at the calendar, and the guy didn't want to schedule anything past 1988. Why? He said, well, the Lord is coming back in 1988. So we're not scheduling anything past that. Well, you can say that stuff, and I mean, the other preacher and I were being polite. We were looking back and forth at each other. It's like, this is ridiculous. Matter of fact, we actually, the other preacher was a close friend of mine. We were together on New Year's Eve, in 1988, and we tried to call him just to find out what happened, We tried to call him at midnight and couldn't get any answer at his house. When I'm in Indianapolis, because of circumstances where family live and so forth, I drive by that church building often. It's now been 10 years. I mean, it's just a simple lesson. Don't set dates. That's contrary to the Scriptures. Don't set dates. You can't possibly win by that. And if the Lord would come back on a date that you set, I promise you it would only be a coincidence. It would not have anything to do with some study or revelation of yours. Roman numeral 9, I'm sorry. We're going to go back to Hans Hut. Talk about him for a minute. He went beyond the normal teaching of separation of church and state, and he taught the separation of the state and the Christian. He believed that not only did the church not have a responsibility to the state, the individual Christian didn't have a responsibility to the state. So consequently, you shouldn't pay taxes, shouldn't serve in the military, shouldn't get any kind of license from the government, should not acknowledge the state. Of course, he came under criticism even from some Baptists for that. And I will have to tell you, that's all being debated again today, even in Baptist circles. It really is. The debate goes something like this. The Bible teaches us what a legitimate government is. When you've got a government that is doing as much wickedly as Charles V's government was, or you could say as our government is today, it's obviously not exercising legitimate power in light of what's in the Scripture. And so the question is, does that free a Christian from all obligation to that government? And that is the debate. That is the debate that is here today. There are Christians are using the same argument, not to pay income taxes today, not to get licenses and so forth today. And I mean, that is a debate that is there and clear. And I will tell you, some of this stuff is not as simple as people want to make it out to be. A government loses its legitimacy when it goes past what the Bible says about a government, and yet sometimes it's still doing some things that are within what would be its legitimate sphere if it was legitimate. So at that point, is the individual Christian responsible to it or not? I have taken the position that the individual Christian is responsible to government whenever it carries out a legitimate function, even if at the same time it carries out illegitimate functions. But I will tell you, I don't think the issue is so clear that I spend any time criticizing my brothers and sisters in Christ that take a different position on the thing. Some of this, I think, gets complicated and tricky. However, most of the Baptists did not agree with Hans Hut, and he ended up being imprisoned and then trying to escape from prison and being killed while escaping. I will say, while I do not criticize my brothers and sisters that take his position and practice what he practiced, I do think there is something to be said in learning what happened to him. For example, I have a number of friends who will not pay income tax because they believe they as a Christian should not pay income tax to a wicked government. I do not criticize them. I also expect that most of them will go to jail. Okay? And that's something you'd better face. And so what I have said to my preacher friends that take that position, be sure when you preach that to say at the end of the discussion, by the way, you'll probably go to jail. for this conviction. And that's part of the program. Yes?
Didn't Jesus say, give Lord what's his and Caesar what's his?
Yes, and Jesus discussed the subject of taxation, and I'm not going to take time to go into that in detail now. It is clear that Jesus taught there was a legitimate form of government taxation. Then the question becomes, at what point does that government lose the right to do that? But that's a discussion for another time, another class. Roman numeral 10. We've got to get this down. We will not do this section justice. The Kingdom of Munster. One of your favorite shows, I know. Kingdom of Munster. Munster is a real town in Germany, by the way. If you were ever privileged to watch the Munsters television program, you know they were supposed to have come from that town. Believe it or not, that name was not made up for the television program. That's a real town. What happens after Hoffman, has this big movement built up, and then the Lord doesn't come back when he said he was going to. So then the question becomes, what happens to this movement? Well, a fellow named Jan claims to be a prophet of God, and he claims that what it really meant was that men were supposed to bring about the millennium starting in 1533. Well, it sounds exactly like what the Jehovah's Witnesses did when their dates didn't work, and sounds exactly like what the Seventh-day Adventists did when their dates didn't work. So he takes control, with his followers, he takes control of the German city of Munster, and he declares they're starting the millennium there. And he changes the name to the New Jerusalem. And you read about him, he's a first-class crackpot. There's no question about it. But as bad as he is, when he dies, the guy that takes over is worse. His name is John Leyden. I'm going to get the spelling of this very careful so that we don't make any mistakes here. Kingdom of Munster, because he takes over the Kingdom of Munster. And he gets a lot of Anabaptists to move there by promising them complete religious liberty. But as time goes on, he gets crazier and crazier in what he teaches. He starts practicing communism, common ownership of everything. And then he extends the idea to common ownership of wives, particularly by him. And it really does get bizarre here in what he does. And a lot of people like to call Mattis and Leyden Anabaptists because they did believe in separation church and state, at least in theory. By the end of Leyden's function in New Jerusalem, he's united the church and state, and he's both. Ought to be remembered that when people want to blame the excesses of these men on the Baptists, both of these men were ordained Lutheran preachers, and both of them baptized babies. There's no way you can call them legitimate Baptists. And as things got more and more bizarre in Munster, the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans, who were at war with each other, united in sending an army to take control of Munster. And they besieged it. And they, over a period of months, they wore down the city's defenses. And in the name of protecting the people from the excesses of Leyden, they massacred the people. People talk about how terrible Leyden's regime in Munster was, and it was. It becomes the depth of immorality and the depth of foolishness in many directions. But the rescue was even worse. Reminiscent of Waco, the rescue was even worse. And this just became a terrible thing. You read many books, and they will tell you the Kingdom of Munster was an Anabaptist kingdom. Well, by definition, it wasn't at the end, because Leyden united the church and state, which is not an Anabaptist distinctive. He certainly didn't believe in the sole authority of Scripture, and he baptized babies. Not exactly a Baptist idea. But you'll find a lot of the history books like to blame this period on the Baptists. When the armies came in and took these people and just massacred them, and after all these terrible things, and execute Leyden and their other leaders, to make a point, they took cages in the city square, and they put the bodies of Leyden and these other leaders in the cages so that people could watch their bodies rot, just to scare folks into not challenging the powers that be. And the bodies rotted, of course, till there were nothing but skeletons. And the skeletons stayed there so long that they were not taken down until the American troops went into that city at the end of World War II. And the American troops that went into that city saw these skeletons in the cages around the city square and assumed it was something the Nazis had done, and took them down and buried them, not realizing they had actually been there for 400 years. But their point was, to scare folks and challenge, to scare folks in terms of challenging the powers that be, and they left them up all those years to send that message. Okay, this is a complicated, involved period of time that we have run through relatively hurriedly. Are there any questions before we go on to anything else? It's a good question. Main difference between the beliefs of the Lutherans and the Catholics. Luther gets caught in the same trap that Zwingli did. Luther discovers salvation by faith and he begins to preach it, and that doesn't go with the Catholic Church, and he defies the Catholic Church on the subject of salvation by faith. And on that subject, we all willing to unite in declaring him a hero. But as he goes on in his preaching, it becomes obvious there's no place for him in the Catholic Church, and he's ordered to recant and follow the teachings of the Church, ordered to follow the decrees of the councils. And Luther responds by saying that he cannot defer to councils and popes. His heart is a prisoner of God's word. And we can declare him a hero for that too. So as Luther begins to preach, people begin to leave the Catholic Church and rally around the doctrine of salvation by faith and the doctrine of the Bible as the final authority. Well, that's both far better than Roman Catholicism. But Luther falls into the same trap as Zwingli. He knows these people have to literally fight for their lives. And he fears not having a strong government with which to create armies that can fight the Catholic armies. So Luther gives, in his earliest writings, there's a lot that Luther says we would be excited about. But he gives in to the idea of a state church because he wants to have a strong enough governments to produce strong enough armies to fight the Catholic armies on even ground. So he begins to create a new state church to take the place of the Catholic state church. But he wants it to be a state church that preaches salvation by faith and has the Bible as its authority. The only trouble with that is as soon as you have a state church, the Bible is not the authority. The state church is. During Luther's life, the Lutheran Church pretty well stands for the gospel. And Luther himself never really gets caught in promoting the persecution of believers. At least, that's not really true. Let me back up and re-say that. Luther always seems very reluctant to approve the persecution of non-Lutherans. I can't say he never does it, but it always seems to bother him. It always seems to trouble his conscience. But sometimes he feels politically pushed into it. So the Lutheran Church develops, still teaching the gospel, but teaching a state church, and so persecuting anybody that will not cooperate with the state church. That's Luther's lifetime. Within one generation of Luther being gone, the Lutheran Church is teaching that Luther's idea, again, like Zwingli, Catholic Church teaches you baptize babies to start them on the process of salvation. Luther said baptism doesn't have anything to do with salvation. You baptize babies to make them a citizen of the state. Okay? Well, we don't agree with that, but at least he's getting salvation right. We're glad for that. But within a generation after he's gone, the Lutheran Church is teaching you baptize those babies as part of their salvation. And the Lutheran Church becomes so close to the Catholic Church that even by the 1600s, it gets hard to tell the difference. Now, even to this day, there are some Lutheran preachers that study Martin Luther and all that and come up with salvation by faith and teach salvation by faith and actually win some people to Christ, and I'm glad for that. But the majority of Lutherans, even by the 1600s, are teaching the same nonsense doctrines as the Catholics, but instead of saying look to the Catholic Church, they're saying look to the Lutheran Church. Because what happens when you have a state church? It becomes the authority. And protecting and promoting itself takes importance over everything and everybody else. I personally know two Lutheran preachers that preach the gospel. And like I said, well, I'm glad for that. They miss a bundle of other things. But most Lutheran preachers that I have met preach salvation by works through the church. They just argue that it's not the Roman Catholic Church. It's the Lutheran Church. And in the long run, it doesn't matter. I saw, in fact, I really wish I could have bought it. Those of you that are going to take the class on Reformation next semester probably glad I didn't. But I saw a 2,400-page set of material on the Reformation produced by Ian Paisley's church in Ireland to be used in their Bible college. So y'all think you have it rough? That's the reading for one class on the Protestant Reformation. That's the textbook for one class on a Protestant Reformation in their college. Now, it is a 6-hour class that goes over 2 semesters, but it's 2,400 pages. So next time y'all complain about your reading, I want you to remember that. I mean, it's 2 books, over 1,200 pages each, and the books are like this, you know. But I got to see it. I didn't get to buy it. It's not printed here in the United States. It's not for sale here in the United States. I saw somebody had one. He wouldn't sell his. But I'm looking through it, and it goes in tremendous length about Luther's early doctrines and how they changed and developed because of the pressures of the warfare with the Roman Catholics, and where he finally ends up, and what Melanchthon and the next generation take Lutheranism to, and so forth. I mean, it goes through it all in great detail. Again, I'm not going to defend what Luther did. I am going to say Luther's looking out at people who were following him and saying, how am I going to keep them from getting killed? Okay? That is a temptation you and I have not had to deal with. So, again, I'm not defending his mistake, but I am telling you that's the context in which he made the mistake of establishing a state church. Okay? You are dismissed.